Okay, so you guys sent in a ton of stuff about fear and trauma, and honestly, some of it was really intense. So, um, we're gonna try to pull out the most important stuff from it for you today.
Right. We want to make it useful, like give you guys some actual takeaways and tools you can use.
Yeah, for sure. So we've got all this like sciencey stuff and expert opinions
Hmm.
and even a study that says like spending 5 minutes a day kind of stressing yourself out on purpose can help with like depression and fear.
Yeah, that one was definitely a head scratcher at first.
I know, right? We're going to break all that down for you later though. But first we got to lay the groundwork.
Exactly. Like, what is fear and trauma really?
Yeah.
We all use those words, but what's actually happening in your brain and body?
Yeah, we're going deeper than just feeling stressed or anxious. We're talking like the nuts and bolts of this stuff.
Right. So we're going to look at three main things. First, we'll break down the biology, like the cells and the brain circuits and the chemicals that are all talking to each other when you experience fear or trauma.
And then we'll get into how your brain can actually unlearn fear, which is super important.
Yeah, and a key part of that is replacing the fear with something positive. Like, you can't just erase it. You got to fill that space with something good.
Right. Makes sense. And then finally, we'll give you guys some actual tools to work with based on all the science we're going to unpack.
Cool. So let's start with the basics.
Mhm.
What do we even mean when we say fear, stress, anxiety, and trauma? Like, what are we actually talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all have a general sense of what those words mean, but I'm curious to hear how you define them from a biological perspective.
Well, fear is really interesting because it's both physical and mental. Your heart starts racing, your blood flow changes, but you're also having specific thoughts and memories that are all tied up in that feeling.
So it's not just in your head, it's like a whole body experience, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Now, stress is a bit broader. You need some elements of the stress response to feel fear, like your body has to get revved up. But you can be stressed without being afraid. Like, think about a deadline at work. You're
Yeah.
stressed, but not necessarily terrified.
Right? So stress is kind of the umbrella term. And fear is a more specific type of response that happens under that umbrella.
Yeah, what about anxiety?
Oh, yeah, anxiety. That's another one that gets thrown around a lot. How does that fit in?
Well, anxiety is often about a future event, like you're worried or apprehensive about something that might happen. So there's that stress response again. But it's not always tied to a specific identifiable fear in that moment. It's more like this general sense of unease.
So fear is more immediate. Like there's a spider right there. And anxiety is more about what if there's a spider later?
That's a good way to think about it. Now, the big question is what makes something trauma? Like, when does fear cross that line?
Yeah, that's a big one. I'm really curious to hear your take on this.
So the way the sources define trauma is basically fear that gets stuck in your nervous system. It's like the fear response gets triggered even when there's no actual danger. And it causes problems in your life. It's not helping you, it's holding you back.
So it's like your body's alarm system is going off all the time, even when there's no fire.
Exactly. The sources also mention phobias, which are like extreme fears of very specific things, and panic attacks, which are those sudden, intense waves of fear that seem to come out of nowhere. But our main focus today is really on the core biology of fear and how it can become trauma. So let's talk about autonomic arousal.
Okay, autonomic arousal.
Hmm.
That sounds kind of technical. What is that exactly?
Basically, it's your body's automatic functions, like your heart rate, your breathing, your digestion, all the stuff you don't have to think about.
Right, so like my heart's beating right now, but I'm not consciously telling it to beat.
Exactly. And this whole system has two main parts. The sympathetic nervous system, which is like the gas pedal, it ramps things up, gets you ready for action. And then the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the brakes, it calms you down, conserves energy.
So these two are always working together, right? Trying to find that balance.
Exactly, like a seesaw. Hopefully right now you're somewhere in the middle. Alert, but not freaking out. Relaxed, but not falling asleep.
Makes sense. Now, the sources talk a lot about the HPA axis. What's that all about?
Mm-hmm.
And how does it relate to fear?
Ah, yes, the HPA axis. That stands for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It's basically your body's central stress response system.
Okay, break that down for me. What happens when you experience fear?
So let's say you see a bear in the woods. Your brain, especially a part called the hypothalamus, senses danger, and it sends a signal to the pituitary gland, which releases hormones into your bloodstream.
Hormones. Okay, so this is already getting complex.
Just wait, there's more. Those hormones travel to your adrenal glands, which are these little guys that sit on top of your kidneys, and the adrenal glands release adrenaline and cortisol.
Okay, adrenaline, I know that one. That's
Yeah.
a fight or flight hormone.
Exactly, it gives you that burst of energy and focus you need to deal with the threat. And cortisol is more a long-term stress hormone. It helps your body keep accessing energy and stay alert.
So the HPA axis is basically getting you ready to fight the bear or run away like really fast.
Exactly. Now, the tricky thing with fear and trauma is that this HPA axis response can get kind of stuck in the on position.
Oh no, so like even when the bear is gone, you're still feeling that surge of adrenaline and cortisol.
Yeah, and it can have lasting effects. Your body stays in a heightened state of alert even when there's no real danger. And those hormones can even change how your genes express themselves, which means they can actually change the structure of your brain.
Wow, so a single scary experience can actually have long-term consequences for your brain and body. That's kind of scary in itself.
It is. And it helps explain why trauma can be so persistent and so hard to shake. Now let's shift gears and talk about the brain itself, specifically the parts that are involved in processing fear.
Okay, bring on the brain science.
So the star of the show here is the amygdala. It's this little almond-shaped structure deep in your brain. Actually, you have two, one on each side. And it's basically the control center for what we call a threat reflex.
Threat reflex. That sounds serious. What is that exactly?
It's your brain and body's automatic response to anything that seems dangerous. Like imagine you're walking in the dark and you hear a loud noise. Your amygdala is going to fire up instantly and trigger a whole cascade of responses.
So like my heart's going to pound,
Okay.
my breathing's going to get faster, I'm going to get that tunnel vision thing.
Exactly. Your body's preparing to either fight or flee. It's prioritizing survival. But here's the thing. The amygdala's response is actually pretty generic. It doesn't know if that noise you heard is a tiger or a car backfiring. It just knows something's up and it needs to get you ready to react.
So it's like our brains are wired to learn what to be afraid of. We're not born afraid of everything, but we're primed to learn those fears quickly.
Exactly. And that's where things like Pavlovian conditioning come in. You know, like Pavlov's dogs.
Right. I remember that from Psych 101.
Yeah.
But remind me how that works.
So basically, you pair something that naturally causes fear, like a loud noise, with something neutral, like a certain sound or a place. And over time, your brain starts to associate those two things. So eventually, just hearing that sound can trigger the fear response, even without the loud noise.
So that's how we develop fears of things that aren't inherently dangerous. Like maybe you had a bad experience with a dog as a kid, and now you're afraid of all dogs, even though most dogs are totally friendly.
Exactly. And the amygdala is getting all this information from different parts of the brain. It's getting sensory input from your eyes and ears, and it's also getting memories from the hippocampus, which is like your brain's filing cabinet for experiences.
So the amygdala is like the central hub. It's taking in all this information about what's happening right now and what's happened in the past, and then it decides whether to trigger the threat reflex.
Right. And once the amygdala decides there's a threat, it sends signals out to other parts of the brain and body to initiate that whole cascade of responses we talked about. Like one pathway goes to the hypothalamus, which then signals the adrenal glands to release all those stress hormones.
So that's the adrenaline and cortisol kicking in, getting you ready to fight or flee.
Exactly. Another pathway goes to the PAG, which stands for periaqueductal gray. It's a mouthful, you know.
It is. But what does it do?
So the PAG can trigger a bunch of different defensive behaviors, like freezing, which is basically just shutting down completely, or fawning, which is like trying to appease the threat by acting submissive. And it can even release your body's natural painkillers called endogenous opioids.
Whoa, wait. So like my body is preparing me to potentially get hurt by releasing painkillers.
Exactly. It's kind of wild, right? It's all about survival.
Yeah.
Your brain's like, okay, this is serious. We might need to numb the pain.
And I'm guessing the amygdala is also sending signals to release adrenaline, right?
You got it. It connects to the locus coeruleus, which is another part of the brainstem that releases norepinephrine and epinephrine. Both of those are going to ramp up your arousal and vigilance, make you super alert.
Okay, so we've got all these pathways activating the stress response, getting you ready to deal with danger. But there's one more connection that I found really interesting. The amygdala also talks to the dopamine system, right?
Yeah, that's a crucial one. The dopamine system is usually associated with pleasure and reward, but it's also really important for learning and memory. And it turns out even fear learning involves the dopamine system, specifically a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens.
So even when you're having a negative experience like being chased by a bear, your brain is still using the reward pathways to solidify that memory.
Exactly. It's all about making sure you remember the experience so you can avoid it in the future.
Okay, so we've got this whole system for detecting threats and triggering fear responses. It's pretty intense.
Yeah.
But is there any way to control it? Like, can we use our conscious mind to override these automatic reactions?
That's where the prefrontal cortex comes in. It's the part of your brain that's responsible for higher level thinking, planning, decision making. And it can actually exert some control over the amygdala and the threat reflex.
So it's like the prefrontal cortex is the rational part of your brain that can step in and say, whoa, hold on a second. Maybe this isn't as dangerous as it seems.
Exactly. It's all about top-down processing. Your prefrontal cortex can use logic and reasoning to reframe the situation and calm down the amygdala's fear response.
So, like, if I see a snake in the garden, my amygdala might freak out, but my prefrontal cortex can remind me that it's just a harmless garter snake and I don't need to run away screaming.
Exactly. Your thoughts and your interpretations of events play a huge role in how you experience fear. So that's a good thing, because it means you have some power to change those interpretations and regulate your fear response.
That's encouraging. Now let's talk about how we learn fear in the first place. The sources mention something called one-trial learning, which sounds pretty intense.
Yeah, one trial learning is basically what it sounds like. You can learn a fear after just one single really bad experience.
So, like, if you got bitten by a dog as a kid, that one bite could be enough to make you afraid of dogs for life.
Exactly. Our brains are wired to quickly learn from negative experiences. It's a survival mechanism. If something hurts you once, you don't want to repeat that mistake.
Right, makes sense. But these fears aren't always formed from these big traumatic events. Sometimes it's more like a gradual accumulation of smaller, stressful experiences, right?
Totally. Your fear system is picking up on all sorts of cues and experiences. And if you're constantly exposed to stress or threat, even if it's not life or death stuff, it can still lead to learned fears and anxiety.
So it's like your brain is constantly taking notes, it's noticing patterns and forming associations. And if those patterns involve a lot of stress or negativity, it can definitely wire you to be more fearful.
Exactly. And at the biological level, this learning is happening through changes in the connections between your neurons. This is called long-term potentiation, or LTP.
LTP, okay. I'm trying to keep up. What is that exactly?
Basically, it's the strengthening of the connections between neurons that fire together. When you learn something new, especially something related to fear, the connections between the neurons involved in that fear response become stronger. So it's like building a new pathway in the brain specifically for that fear.
So it's like the more you travel down that fear pathway, the more well-worn it becomes. And the easier it is for your brain to activate that fear response in the future.
Exactly. Now, the good news is that your brain can also weaken those connections. It's not like once a fear pathway is formed, it's there forever.
So there's hope, right?
Yep.
Like we can actually unlearn these fears.
Absolutely. And that's where fear extinction comes in. It's the process of weakening the association between the thing you fear and the fear response itself.
This is like gradually dismantling that well-worn fear pathway.
Exactly. And the biological process behind that is called long-term depression, or LTD. It's the opposite of LTP. Instead of strengthening the connections between neurons, LTD weakens them. So it's like letting that fear pathway fall into disrepair.
So extinction is like paving over that old fear road. Makes sense. But the sources really emphasize that it's not enough to just extinguish the fear. We also need to replace it with something positive. Why is that?
That's a really key point. If you just erase a fear pathway, you're left with a void. And that void can easily be filled by another fear or anxiety. So for lasting change, you need to actively build a new pathway, a new association that's positive or at least neutral.
So it's not enough to just stop being afraid of spiders. You need to replace that fear with something else. Like maybe you learn to appreciate spiders for their role in the ecosystem, or you just become indifferent to them.
Exactly. You got to fill that space with something good. Now, how does all this relate to therapy?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. Like, how do these biological processes actually translate into treatments for fear and trauma?
Well, a lot of therapies like exposure therapy, cognitive processing therapy, and cognitive behavioral therapy are based on these very principles.
Okay, so walk me through it. How does that work?
So a central part of these therapies involve the person talking about their trauma or their fear in detail in a safe, controlled environment with a therapist.
It's basically reliving the experience.
In a way. But the key is that they're doing it with support and guidance. And as they retell the story over and over again, the intensity of their fear response starts to diminish. This is extinction in action.
So by repeatedly facing the fear in a safe setting, they're gradually weakening that fear pathway in their brain.
Exactly. But the sources also caution that this kind of exposure therapy should be done with professional support, because if it's not done carefully, it can actually backfire and make the trauma worse.
Right. It makes sense that you wouldn't want to just relive a traumatic experience without any guidance or support. That could be really overwhelming.
Exactly. Now, once the fear response starts to decrease, that's when the replacement part comes in. The therapist helps the person reframe their experience and develop a new narrative around it.
So instead of seeing themselves as a victim, they might start to see themselves as a survivor.
Exactly. And they might start to identify and challenge those negative thoughts and beliefs that are keeping them stuck in fear.
So they're basically rewiring their brain to create a new positive association with the thing they used to fear.
That's the goal. And remember how we talked about the connection between the amygdala and the dopamine reward system? Well, that comes into play here too. By creating new positive experiences that are linked to the old triggers of fear, we can start to build new, healthier pathways in the brain.
That's amazing. So our brains are constantly changing and adapting. And therapy can actually help us guide that process in a positive direction.
Totally. Now, what about EMDR? Have you heard of that?
EMDR.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, right? It's a therapy that's often used for trauma.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always been a little unclear on how it actually works.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mystery to a lot of people, but there's growing evidence that it can be really effective. So basically, EMDR involves moving your eyes back and forth in a specific way while you're thinking about the traumatic memory.
And that somehow helps.
Yeah, it sounds strange, but studies have shown that these eye movements can actually reduce activity in the amygdala, which is that fear center in the brain.
Wow, so it's like the eye movements are somehow interrupting the fear response.
That's one theory. And there might be an evolutionary reason for this too. Like when we're walking or running, our eyes naturally move from side to side. And those actions are usually incompatible with freezing or hiding, which are typical fear responses. So it's possible that the eye movements are sending a signal to the brain that it's safe to move and that there's no need to be afraid.
That's fascinating. So EMDR might be tapping into some ancient survival mechanisms to help us overcome trauma.
It's possible. Now, one thing to note is that while EMDR is really good at reducing the emotional intensity of a traumatic memory, it might not always address the cognitive restructuring part as much, like helping the person develop a new narrative and build those positive associations.
So it's like EMDR takes the sting out of the memory, but other therapies might be more focused on helping you make sense of the experience and create a new story around it.
That's a good way to think about it. Now, shifting gears a bit, the sources also talk a lot about the importance of social connection in healing from fear and trauma.
Yeah, that makes sense. We all know that having people to support us can make a huge difference when we're going through something tough. But is there a biological basis for that?
There is, and it's pretty amazing. So researchers have found that social isolation can actually increase levels of a molecule called tachykinin in the brain.
Tachykinin. Okay, what's that?
It's a neuropeptide that's involved in the fear response. And when levels are high, it can contribute to anxiety and even aggression.
So being alone can actually make your fear and anxiety worse.
Exactly. On the flip side, having strong social connections can actually reduce the effects of tachykinin. So spending time with people you trust, talking to them, sharing meals, physical touch, all of that can help buffer your brain against the negative impacts of fear and trauma.
Wow. So there's a real neurochemical basis for why social support is so important.
Totally. It's not just about feeling good, it's about actually changing the chemistry of your brain. Now, one more thing I want to touch on is the idea of transgenerational trauma.
Transgenerational trauma. So like the idea that trauma can be passed down from one generation to the next.
Exactly. It's a complex topic, and there's still a lot we don't know. But there's growing evidence that the offspring of parents who experience trauma might be more susceptible to developing trauma themselves.
So like if your parents went through something really traumatic, you might be more likely to experience PTSD or anxiety or depression.
It's possible. Now, it's important to understand that this isn't about inheriting the specific memories of your parents' trauma. It's more about inheriting a predisposition, a kind of vulnerability to developing those issues yourself.
So like your genes might make you more sensitive to stress, or your brain might be wired in a way that makes you more likely to develop fear responses.
Exactly. And there's some research suggesting that this might be due to changes in how your genes express themselves. These changes are called epigenetic modifications, and they can happen in response to environmental factors like trauma.
So like your parents' experiences can actually change how your genes function.
Exactly. It's pretty wild. But the good news is that even if you inherit this predisposition, it doesn't mean you're destined to experience trauma. It just means you might need to be a little more mindful of your mental health and take steps to manage stress and build resilience.
Right. So it's not a life sentence. It's just something to be aware of. Yeah. Now let's talk about some of the newer treatments for trauma, specifically ketamine-assisted therapy and MDMA-assisted therapy.
Okay, so these are definitely cutting edge and still somewhat controversial, but they're showing a lot of promise in clinical trials.
So how do they work?
Well, ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic, which means it can create a sense of detachment from reality.
So you're not fully present in the moment.
Exactly. And the idea is that by using ketamine in a controlled therapeutic setting, people can revisit traumatic memories without experiencing the full intensity of the emotional pain.
So it's like taking the edge off the trauma so they can process it more easily.
Right. And there's some evidence that ketamine can also help promote the growth of new connections in the brain, which could be really helpful for people who have experienced trauma because trauma can actually damage certain brain regions.
Wow, so ketamine could be helping to heal the physical damage caused by trauma.
It's possible.
Yeah.
Now, MDMA is a different beast. It's often called ecstasy, and it's known for producing feelings of euphoria and connection.
So it's like the opposite of a dissociative drug. It's bringing you more into your body and your emotions.
Exactly. And in a therapeutic setting, this can be really powerful because it allows people to access and process traumatic memories with a sense of safety and support.
So instead of feeling overwhelmed by fear and shame, they might feel more open and compassionate towards themselves.
That's the hope. And MDMA also triggers the release of oxytocin, which is that bonding hormone. So it can help create a sense of trust and connection between the therapist and the patient.
That's amazing. So it's like MDMA is creating the ideal conditions for healing and growth.
It's definitely a fascinating area of research, and while both ketamine and MDMA are still illegal outside of clinical trials, they're showing a lot of potential for treating trauma and other mental health conditions.
It's exciting to see these new approaches emerging.
Yeah.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier. The balance between interoception and exteroception.
Yes, those are two big words,
Yeah.
but they're really important concepts. Interoception is your awareness of your internal bodily sensations, like your heart rate, your breathing, your gut feelings. And exteroception is your awareness of the external world, what you see, hear, touch.
Okay, so one is internal and one's external.
Yep.
Got it. But how do they relate to fear and trauma?
Well, fear and trauma essentially involve external cues or experiences triggering those internal threat responses. So like if you see a snake, that's an external stimulus, but it triggers an internal reaction like a racing heart and sweaty palm.
Right, so it's the external world impacting our internal world.
Exactly. And there's a part of the brain called the insular cortex that plays a key role in this whole process. It's basically the brain's map of the body. It receives all those internal sensations and helps us make sense of them.
So the insular cortex is like the translator between our body and our brain.
In a way. And that helps us determine whether our internal reactions are appropriate given the external circumstances. So like if you're walking down a dark alley and you hear footsteps behind you, it makes sense that your heart would start racing. But if you're sitting in your living room and your heart starts pounding for no reason, that might be a sign that something's off.
So the insular cortex is helping us calibrate our internal responses to match the external reality.
Exactly. And this calibration can get thrown off in people with trauma. You know, they might have a huge internal reaction to something that's not actually that threatening.
So it's like their alarm system is set to super sensitive.
Exactly. And there's some really interesting research suggesting that we might be able to recalibrate the system through things like breath work and even short bursts of intentional stress. Wait, intentional stress? Like purposefully stressing yourself out?
Yeah, it sounds counterintuitive, but there's a study that showed that giving mice short bursts of stress every day actually reversed the effects of chronic stress and depression.
Wow, really? So like a little bit of stress can actually be good for you.
It might be, and we're doing some research on this in humans using different breathing techniques.
So what kind of breathing techniques are you using?
One is called physiological sighing. It involves taking 2 deep inhales through the nose, followed by a long exhale through the mouth. And it's really effective at calming down the nervous system.
So it's like a deep reset for your body.
Exactly. And then we're also looking at a technique called cyclic hyperventilation, which is basically controlled hyperventilation.
Okay, hold on. Hyperventilation. That sounds kind of dangerous.
It can be if it's not done properly. That's why we're doing this research in a very controlled setting. But the idea is that by briefly increasing your arousal levels in a controlled way, you might be able to reset your fear system and make it less sensitive over time. So it's like giving your body a little taste of stress so it doesn't freak out when it encounters real stress.
It's a possibility. Now, I want to emphasize that this is still very much experimental, and we don't recommend trying cyclic hyperventilation on your own, especially if you have a history of anxiety or panic attacks.
Right, safety first. Always consult with a healthcare professional before trying any new breathing techniques or treatments.
Absolutely. But it's exciting to see these new approaches being explored, and it really highlights the power of the mind-body connection.
Totally. So to recap, we've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about the biology of fear and trauma, the role of the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, the importance of extinction and replacement in therapy, the potential of EMDR and psychedelic-assisted therapies, the healing power of social connection, the idea of transgenerational trauma, and even some cutting-edge research on breathwork and intentional stress.
It's been a wild ride.
It has. And I hope our listeners are walking away with a better understanding of how fear and trauma work and some new tools to help them navigate these challenges.
Me too. Remember, you're not alone in this. And there's always hope for healing and growth.
And on that note, we're going to leave you with a final thought. What if embracing discomfort in small doses could actually make us more resilient in the long run? It's a provocative idea and one that's worth exploring further.
It is. Just remember to approach it with curiosity and caution, and always prioritize your safety and well-being.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the neuroscience of fear and trauma. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.